And they secretly made plans to begin to try to control the earth. The beginning of the secret government, going all the way back to Atlantis. And they immediately began to create the pyramids and the functional buildings that they had done on Sidonia, on Atlantis, to recreate the external Merkaba, to gain control of space and time, and thereby to be able to control the planet Earth. They lost control of this huge counter-rotating field of energy, and was not able to, and I mean really lost control. And I'm sure it scared the pants off of even those guys. And it began to rip open the dimensional levels around Earth. Primarily the lower dimensional levels. In fact, I think it was totally the lower dimensional levels. It could have equally been the higher dimensional levels, but that isn't what happened. And it would have been better if it had been. It would have been a much easier situation to heal. But that isn't what happened. And this was a situation kind of like, in terms of the human body, the dimensions are like different parts of the body. It's like you have organs, you got a heart doing one thing, a liver doing another thing, and you got a stomach doing another thing. And you don't want to break the membranes that go between all these things. And the membranes are like the dimensional thresholds that this Merkaba just ripped apart. And it was more like a tear, like a rip. And so it'd be just like taking your stomach lining and just ripping it open. And what happens is cells, or spirits, from other dimensional levels, on the other side of the membrane, or like blood, came pouring into the stomach. You're not supposed to do that. That's against the law. And so you had billions of these, and maybe a lot more than just billions, of these lower dimensional, interdimensional spirits or beings coming in to this higher dimensional world for them, and they were scared to death. They were like little children, scared to death. This was outside of their experience, and they were flowed in here. It wasn't their fault. Poured in here, and and it was a horrible situation. The ascended masters of the earth, with at that time there were only about 1,600 of them, did everything they could to heal the situation and acted as rapidly as they could. And they did a very good job, and if it had not been for them, it would have been all over. We would have lost this place. It would have been gone. We would have lost it. But they managed to seal up the dimensional levels, and they managed to get most of these spirits back into the place where they're supposed to be. But not all of them. Many of them came into the people that existed in Atlantis at that time. And even into people all around the world, but mostly into the Atlanteans, into the area where this took place. And they just went into people. And so the people were no longer alone in their bodies, but they had anywhere from 1 to hundreds of other people in their bodies with them at the same time. And it was horrible. And there was like an internal war going on, and struggle. And everything began to degenerate horribly. All the systems broke down. All the emotional bodies, and that, all your kinds of systems of all kinds of levels that we call culture, all broke down to nothing. And total chaos ensued. Disease became rampant. And in the last 40,000 years of Atlantis, it was a living hell. It was the worst, much worse than anything you can conceive of on Earth. It was absolutely terrible everywhere. And it was looking like if it continued the way it was going, Earth would just die. And I mean a real permanent kind of death, where not this environmental stuff where the Earth could restore itself, but a real permanent death where it would just not be able to be used for its real purpose, which is to a starseed, to seed cultures and races to go out. And so they didn't know what to do, and so they called in many of the different consciousness levels from all over, from galactic levels to all kinds of places and things. I don't know if Galactic Command was called in on that kind of level, but there were a lot of levels of life that were asked for help, and nobody really knew exactly what to do. There had been kind of a plan that had been taking place before, and so that was looked at, and after a while it was finally decided that's what they ought to do. And again, what they were looking for was a situation where both sides would win. Both the Martians would come out of it, and the Lemurians would come out of it in such a way that they could become friends again and keep going and keep growing through this whole situation. It's kind of like looking for a situation where the Israelis and the Arabs can both live together and be happy. Not easy, you know. I mean, when you got hate going back and forth and all kinds of weird stuff and everything's in chaos, it's really hard. On the other hand, you can't just go down there and just shoot all the Martians or shoot all the Lemurians or whatever, because the higher consciousness knows that that there is no such thing as death. There's only transformation, and that they're tied to the evolutionary pattern. So it's just all going to recycle back again. The problem would just be delayed for a short time. It wouldn't solve anything. So they were looking for a real solution. Meanwhile, it's getting worse and worse and worse. They finally decided that they were going to wait till this particular moment over here, because that's the moment of transformation. They know that you can make certain kinds of consciousness changes and transformation at that time that would be easier then than at any other time. It's the proper moment for that kind of thing. So they had to wait for 4,000 years, or whatever that number difference is there. And then when they came, about 200 years before this is when it really began, right in this little, just a couple hundred years before that time, right in there. What it was decided is that they would synthetically put the planet. They knew that we'd already dropped down through the levels, down, 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 because of this experiment. The experiment was still going on and was still out of control, though they had managed to confine it to what that pattern is what many people call the Bermuda Triangle. The star tetrahedral field that's still sitting down there on the ocean floor is primarily submerged, and it's a counter-rotating field. Part of it, when the mathematical differences between the one that's rotating counterclockwise and the one that's rotating clockwise means that there is a greater differences going clockwise, and the whole thing is moving this way, then everything is normal. But when it reaches its peak and the other side starts rotating back the other way, then it ends up being abnormal. And you have this triangular shape sticking out of the ocean, the apex of this thing, and which is the locked aspect of the field. And when anything that's inside of this sphere of energy, and especially the tetrahedral aspect of it, when that thing starts going clockwise, you have space-time distortion. And all you got to do is just look back through all of the various things, and the airplane pilots and the boats and all the other stuff that we've seen, all the crazy things that have gone on, and you can go right in here in 1 hour and have no problem, and because as long as it's going that way, there's no problem. As soon as it goes back the other way, bingo, you can have all this stuff going on that is weird because of the very nature of what a Merkaba is. So anyway, they decided to create, they knew that we were going to fall, and they knew we were going to fall heavy, and they were hoping we wouldn't fall any lower than where we are now. And they knew that once we got down here, if all things would go well, that they could get us back once we got over to this other point over here, which is where we are now, if it was carefully planned. And what they had to do then was to reconstruct, and which in effect would be to synthetically create a Christ consciousness grid that was destroyed when we fell. A new Christ consciousness grid for us, which is actually something that wouldn't normally happen. If we'd have fallen and they just didn't do anything, we would stay where we are for a long time before we would come around to the place where we'd ever make it back up to Christ consciousness again. So they decided that in order to save us, they would synthetically, or alchemically, however you want to look at it, step in and create the Christ consciousness grid around the earth long before it would normally take place. And they began 200 years before the fall actually took place. They did that by going out into the desert, which wasn't a desert then. It was a beautiful rainforest, actually, in an area that we now call Egypt and Giza, which is now a desert. And they went out to a very specific spot there because in the halls of Amenti, where the little flame of consciousness, that there are these poles that come out, these axis things of all the various levels of consciousness that we will someday arrive at. And one of those is the Christ consciousness one. And the pole actually comes right out of the earth at a very specific spot, and I mean really specific, like about the size of an atom, out in the middle of the desert there, which wasn't a desert then. And it's a vortex. It's a rotating field coming out. And there's one at the bottom, which is on a little island called Maria, out in the Pacific Ocean, and where the two poles emanate from each other. And one is female and one is male. And so they went to this spot, and it was Ra and Aragat and Thoth who went to this spot. These were three men that were from the Nicole Mystery School. And they went there, and they made a hole in the ground. Which was just sort of nothing there. They just made this little hole in the ground. Only the hole was about, well, I don't know, 6-8 feet around, and it was lined with bricks, and it went for 1 mile into the earth approximately. You'll understand here a little while why they did this out of stone and didn't use sophisticated metals or things like this, which would be more high-tech looking and more sophisticated in some ways. There's a very definite reason why they chose to use natural materials. And coming out of there was this would be an aerial view from above. There was this vortex coming out like this into space. This would be like the shadow on the surface of the earth of that vortex from above. And then there was really more than one of these coming out of there. I think there's 4. But they chose one. I don't know why they chose this particular one, but they did. And then on a 4th dimensional level, they made three pyramids that were lined up, so the apexes were lined up precisely on the spiral. And then they created this one, which is now called the Great Pyramid. These two were created much later, but they were 4th dimensionally created there in the first place. And then there's actually 6 more little pyramids that were made there. They were timing devices. And then over in this spot over here, they built a building which the Egyptians did not find until about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe. I was there in 85, so it's been, time goes by, doesn't it? It's been It's been over almost 15 years now, I guess, that when they first discovered that. There's a building there, and if you go there, you'll see that there's only about that much of the building left, the foundation. It's a golden mean rectangle building, and I think it looks like it. And they have taken aerial surveys of this and found that the center of the whole, the south face of the building, and the north face of the Great Pyramid, which I don't have this lined up right, it'll be over here. These things are all in a perfect, flawless line. They can't see it at all. And there's like about over a mile between these things. And it's so perfect that they just can't conceive of how the Egyptians could possibly have done that from so far away. But there it sits. And this line between this whole thing marks the center of this hole. So, and then later they have discovered that there is another one out there, about a block away, and another spiral coming around through this whole thing. This one, they have discovered, is a Fibonacci spiral, and this one is a golden mean spiral, which we'll get into this later, showing that they actually knew the difference between these whole things. They were perfectly lined up. And but a little later we'll talk about all this, because this is real important, because from an Egyptian point of view, you could not resurrect if you didn't know the difference between a Fibonacci spiral and a logarithmic spiral. It was essential for their particular resurrection philosophy. And I'll say this, though, the proof has not come out, but eventually it will. Because Thoth said this one, not only is this laid out in a logarithmic spiral, and golden mean spiral, but all the sacred sites on the planet are laid out on either golden mean or logarithmic spirals, and they are all mathematically delineated back to this single point here, or actually it could be probably the one set is delineated here and the other set is delineated there. But that's the origin of all of them. All the temples that go down the Nile are all laid out on these logarithmic spirals or Fibonacci spirals. But everything over the whole planet is. And I don't think there's any exceptions to this. Though there might be. There's exceptions to just about everything, but there's not going to be much if there is. And what many people are discovering now is that the whole system is holographic. That once you know one building, you can determine what the next one's going to be, and you can keep doing this all the way through. That there's an interrelationship between all these various times and cultures that are all over the world, that there was a greater mind working through all of this, that the Peruvians were not working on their own, that the Mexicans were not working on their own, the Tibetans and the American Indians, all these various people, that there was a greater mind doing all of this. And the evidence keeps pouring in daily on that this is true. So anyway, they began the process there. They built this one pyramid right here. They then built a huge city, a city of temples really, underneath the Great Pyramid, which they have located some of the rooms of this, though they do not understand it because they're in the Nile. They found them. They're inside the Nile with water flowing around them, but there's no water in the rooms. But they go way deep into the earth. The Great Pyramid sits on a huge mountain of solid rock. And underneath that, in the apex, that rock structure that's underneath there is a complex designed to hold about 10,000 people. And it never quite needed that many, but they made it a little bit bigger than they needed. Eventually, it held about 8,000 people at its maximum point, because that was how many people reached immortality on the earth toward the very end of all of this. So they built all of this stuff, laid out the whole things, laid out the whole patterns, and then went back and sat on Atlantis for 200 years and watched everything degenerate even further. And then finally, no more than hours before Atlantis sank, they went back to this little place, which was called the land of Klim, which meant the hairy barbarians. They went to a place that we call, which is right near there, which is called the Sphinx. Now in the Emerald Tablets, by the way, it says that Thoth created the Sphinx. But according to Thoth himself, he said that was a mistake by Durrell. And he also said, by the way, for some people here, that Durrell made many mistakes in the interpretation of the Emerald Tablets. That there are many, for example, in Durrell's interpretation, when he talks about this ship that I'm about to talk about, he says that it had atomic motors. This was interpreted in 1925, or 27, somewhat 1925. And that was the most far out thing that Durrell could think about. But actually there's no motors in there at all. You don't need anything because it's a Merkaba. It's a Merkaba resonance field. So it locks on with a living Merkaba field and is activated. It runs off thought and emotion. It doesn't require motors like we know. But anyway, this is the wrong angle here, but it's all right. The Great Pyramid has a missing capstone. It has a big piece off the top. There's all kinds of ideas about where that missing capstone is and everything. According to Thoth, it's in the halls of records. It's 5.5 inches high. It's solid gold, and it's a holographic image of the whole thing with all the little rooms in it and everything. And it's a miniature of the Great Pyramid. And that's it was not really a capstone. That's a big piece that's missing out there. I think it's 24 feet square. It's not just a few blocks that are missing. When you get up there, it's like a room. It's a big, flat, huge place. And what it is a landing platform. This is according to Thoth's teaching. And the ship was flown back to. They got into it. Thoth was one that flew it the last time. Ron R. also got into it. It used Thoth's spine, though, to activate it. And then they raised it to one overtone higher than the Earth sits on, allowing it to pass right through the Earth, up into the atmosphere. And they flew it to Atlantis. They picked up the rest of the immortal beings that were there. By this time, there were about 1,600 of them. And, is that right? Yeah, about 1,600. And then he said that they got no more than about a quarter mile up away from the surface when all of it, the last bit of Atlantis went into the water. And they all sat there and watched this thing go in the water. And then they flew from there to Egypt and landed on top of this thing. So that must have been quite a sight. Considering that this was perfectly smooth, with stones that are fitted so close together that you couldn't even hardly see the seams. Couldn't even get a piece of paper in the middle. And perfectly smooth, gleaming white, and this transparent flat disc sitting on top. If you'd have brought the pyramid up to its apex, the top would have exactly hit where the top surface of this was. And if you were to look at this from above, this is what you would see. Let's do it in the proper colors, I guess. You would see, I'm going to make this smaller. You'd see the pyramid like this. And you would see this thing sitting on top of it, approximately like that. The perimeter or the circumference of this ship was equal to the perimeter of the Great Pyramid. For those of you who know sacred geometry, that's the dimensions of life itself, which we'll talk about when we get into the sacred geometry and all this other stuff. And he said they no sooner landed on there, locked in their fields and everything. Now remember, this is an entire group of 1,600 people creating a group Merkaba that is a rotating field where there's a star tetrahedral pattern moving in here and a bunch of other ones, which I'm not going to get into. And there's a spherical pattern in that. And then a huge Merkaba field around that. And they lock that in, creating their own electromagnetic and magnetic fields. Very, very important in a pole shift, because when the pole shifts, what happens is, for hundreds of years prior to the pole shifting, the magnetic field begins to decrease, going down and down and down and down, which our science will tell you has been going on for 500 years on Earth. It's been getting weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker for 500 years. And now beginning to migrate and move. This is the reason the whales come in and land into the beaches and things, because they're following these ancient electromagnetic lines, which have been a certain way for a long time, which are now distorting and moving into land masses, and they're just following these things right into there, which are not supposed to be there. It's all getting distorted and changed and getting weaker. We will come up to a place right prior to the poles shifting when the magnetic field of the Earth will just collapse in. It'll go away. There won't be any. A little later, I'll show you an article here that they have just discovered something brand new in the human brain. They haven't discovered anything new in the human body in 300 years. They just discovered something, and that is that the cells of the human brain have magnets in them. And there's a magnetic sheet that moves around the entire brain, which they never knew was there. And what they will eventually discover is that memory is a function of a magnetic field, which has a very specific geometrical pattern, which I'll show you a little later, and that it requires a low-level external magnetic field to keep it intact. And not just any kind of field. It needs the Earth, or it needs a pattern that can be regenerated, very much like the Earth. And when that pattern totally goes away, something else also goes away. It's called memory. It's like pulling the plug on the computer. We know nothing. Everything we've stored is gone. And this is what happened in Atlantis. Here's all these people, very, very sophisticated. You would really be amazed at how sophisticated they were, and where they were at, and what the levels of awareness they were at. And all of a sudden, in a 20-hour period, gone. No awareness, nothing. Didn't even know how to... just imagine what happened right now. If you suddenly had your mind erased, you wouldn't even know how to get out of this building. You wouldn't know what anything was for. It would just be like, it would just be pure survival. You would still be alive, you'd be conscious, you'd be aware. But you wouldn't know what anything was. You wouldn't know how to open a door. You wouldn't know anything. And these people were right back to figuring out how to make fires and keep alive and stay warm. And right back down to the basics again. But not these guys. Because they had created their own Merkaba field, which keeps their memory intact. And again, the definition that I'm defining immortality is the memory that stays intact. And so once you get your Merkaba, the living field Merkaba in place, you can keep your memory intact under any conditions whatsoever. Even under conditions that you would not imagine that this kind of field could possibly protect you under, like an atomic bomb blowing up or something like this. Wouldn't affect it. You could be right in the midst of it, and it wouldn't even affect it. You could walk away from it. And because it's the basic creation pattern of what created all this stuff. It's what we created the whole thing with. It's what we stepped in with it, and it's the doorway out. No one's going to create an experiment and get into it if there isn't some way out. And that's the way out. And so this magnetic field kept their memories intact while everybody else's was erased, except for one group of people, which I still do not understand how they did it. They had to have some of the ancient memory of the Merkaba, and that's the Mayans. The Mayans came from Atlantis. There's a document called the Toronto document. Let me see if I've still got that. No, I didn't bring it with me this time. There's the Toronto document, which was translated by Pelagion, which is sitting in the British Museum right now. It's Toronto, T-R-O-A-N-O. And it is a series of stones on this wall describing the sinking of Atlantis. And it describes how Atlantis upheaval went up and down, and all these things took place, and how there were 10 countries in Atlantis corresponding to the 10 points, and that 64 million people were killed in one night. And it shows on there the Mayans escaping in these boats while there's these modern-looking cities with pyramids and volcanoes going off everywhere. And then there was 3.5 stones that were painted black, which are the 3.5 days that happens when the field collapses, and the pole shift is 20 hours, okay, but the field is gone for about anywhere from 2.5 to about 4 1/4, and it usually is 3 to 3.5 days long. Those are the minimum and maximum amounts that anybody's ever seen it. But it's usually about 3 or 3.5 days long, and the last time was probably 3.5 days long, because each one of these was a day, and they just painted them black, and then the third one they painted half black, and came back again. And so somehow they were able to keep their memory of all of this, and I don't know how they did it unless there was somebody there that had this awareness. Anyway, so what happened was a lot of these people went all over what's now Europe, the survivors of this, everywhere else, and basically started over. According to Thoth, that's not exactly accurate, but there were survivors around the world, and quite a few of them. And but they had not much going on up there. Though they had a real high-tech body. They had all the equipment. They just didn't have the software. They had the good computer, though. And so anyway, after this, after the deluge came back, I mean, after this all happened, the deluge, by the way, was the poles that were where Hawaii, etc., where they melted completely. That was part of what was going on. But evidently there was another thing going on also, which science is now coming up with. In the Bible it talks about the springs that began to come forth and all of this. Now, has anybody seen the evidence now that they're bringing forth? What science is pretty, they think that there was a huge amount of water in the earth, like a ring around there, and that it began to come forth in just like huge amounts. And there's a lot of physical evidence of this, that the earth was literally just deluged. And on top of this, not only did the poles melt, which would have risen them 200 or 300 feet, but there was much more water coming out of the center of the earth in all of this. Anyway, the Great Pyramids, by the way, were covered with water for a long period of time to about the 2/3 level. This is one of the proofs that the Great Pyramid was not created in the fourth dynasty, as they say. And they don't want to hear this, though, but the evidence is there. The ship was then flown to the island of the Sun, where, well, first of all, Ra got out here by an opening through the top into a room that sat at that exact level where the water level was, at the 2/3 level, which that room has not been found yet, but Tho says it will be. And when they do, they will find that it's made out of red, black, and white stones. And that it was where the ceremony, that Ra came out of there with about 1/3 of the people, held a ceremony and left from there to the underground city. And that, and it was Ra and the approximately 1/3 of the ascended masters of the Naqal Mystery School that began Egypt. The ship was then flown to Peru, specifically to the island of the Sun on Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, and Thoth got out there, and that's where he handed the rod to Marcos, and who became the first king of the Inca Empire, and Thoth stayed there in Peru. It became the love. He loved it there. When I went to Peru, I mean, you could tell by the way he's, and over here he was telling me all these places. In Egypt he wouldn't talk much at all. He doesn't like Egypt, I don't think. But he liked Peru a lot. He had a baby in Peru. I think that's what did it. It softened you up. And anyway, and then the ship was flown to the Himalaya Mountains, where Ara got off, along with about another 1/3 of the people. And 7 of them flew the ship back to the Sphinx, lowered it down in that room, where it remained there until just a couple of years ago, or a few years ago, where it was brought back up into the air by a 23-year-old Peruvian woman who is now controlling the airways. Right now, it's really up to her what happens on a lot of levels of life. And I'm going to leave all of this, concepts of things, and we're going to head into Egypt, though. However, before we do, I'm going to allow questions to be asked here, because we've gone a long time without any. And we've only got about 20 more minutes, and it's 9 o'clock already. We'll have to work real hard tomorrow. Egypt is the area that we're going to focus on. Those 3 areas, Egypt and Peru, which includes the Yucatan all the way down to Peru, and Tibet, in that area up in there, those were chosen because of the nature of the Earth's geometrical and geomancy fields. Egypt became the male aspect of the Christ consciousness grid. The Yucatan Peru became the female aspect of the grid, and the Tibet became the child or the neutral energy of the grid. And there are pyramids in all 3 of those areas. Huh?
That last sentence, please repeat.
Tibet became the neutral or child energy of there's the mommy, daddy, and baby energy of the field. Everything is mommy, daddy, and baby in one way or another. And that female is the Mayan, Peruvian. I'm not going to talk about those other 2 places very much, though my experiences there and everything were really powerful for me, and I learned a lot being in some of those places. But I'm going to focus mostly on Egypt, mostly because the vast majority of people that come to this workshop have Egyptian-based backgrounds, though not always. And it depends. Sometimes I don't, but I think this one is for sure. And we're going to go to Egypt also because that happened to be the only place or area where survivors from Atlantis and the Naqal Mystery School were located at the same place, because in the other ones they were not Atlantean people who survived that, but different races. There's Incans and other races besides the Atlanteans. And we're going to look at the Sumerian and Egyptian cultures as they unfolded and what happened in all of that. That's what we're going to start in when we start in tomorrow. we don't have too much more of that to go into, and we'll eventually focus in on one very specific area of Egypt. If you talk to most Christians or a Catholic right now, they will tend to look at Egypt as being a cult and not a very healthy place to get information from, and I agree with them. There's only one tiny little speck of light that came out of Egypt, and that was for 17 and a half years. That came out of one little dynasty. But it was a real blast of light. And we need to look at what happened there. That's when they said that there was only one God. And what happened in that school was real important. In fact, what happened in that school, according to Thoth and his information, created the Christian religion. It was that one particular school that was the founder behind all of that. And the Coptics that came out of that, and the Essenes that also were affected and came out of that, all of that was all planned from a long time ago. But again, if you are a Christian, you can just listen to this and you don't have to accept it if you don't want to. But this is what Thoth has told me. And so this is the area we're going to head into tomorrow. We're going to get into what is called the Egyptian Mystery School of Akhenaten. We will start in that pretty early tomorrow, and that will lead into the sacred geometry. And we'll begin to get out of this kind of talking about history and going into very, very specific aspects of human nature and the mind.